I'm Ethan Nadelmann. I'm the founder and executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance. We're the leading organization in the United States and probably the world of people who believe that the war on drugs is doing a lot more harm than good, and that the time has come to reduce the role of criminalization, the criminal justice system, in dealing with drugs as much as possible. Yeah, you know, my take on Obama, it's not all good, not all bad. I think that we have to give him credit. I mean, he did make 3 specific commitments when he was running for president back in 2008. He said that he would allow federal funding for needle exchange. He said that he would support repealing the crack powder laws, these horrific, racially unjust laws. And he said he would get the federal government less involved in medical marijuana. And the truth is, he made good on all 3 of those. I mean, he didn't provide the leadership on federal funding for needle exchange, but nonetheless, the bill went through, he signed it. With respect to the crack powder bill, he and his Attorney General Holder, they made that a priority. They pushed to eliminate the disparity in the way crack and powder cocaine are treated as much as possible. And then they locked in a compromise that was actually bipartisan. So we didn't get everything we wanted, but it was an important victory that'll benefit thousands and thousands of people. And lastly, with medical marijuana, that memorandum that Attorney General Holder issued last year, basically saying that the feds are not going to go after medical marijuana operations if they are operating legally under state law, that was huge. That opened up the ability for states to begin to effectively regulate that stuff. When you look what's going on in Colorado, the Holder memorandum opened that up. It sent a message to state legislators around the country that they can now move towards legalizing medical marijuana without fear of federal interference. So those were all very significant. Now, on the other hand, I have been disappointed by his drug czar, Gil Kerlikowske. Good guy, smart guy, a leader among police chief of Seattle, police chief of Seattle, which has Hemp Fest where 100,000 people gather each year and around marijuana and nobody gets arrested. So he knows enough to know better, but unfortunately he's not played a central role in the good reforms that Obama's put forward. He has talked more about turning drug policy, focusing drug policy more on issues of addiction and health, but nonetheless, the basic drug war budget remains the same, about 2/3 for law enforcement and addiction, 1/3 for the other. The wariness, the reluctance to examine things like heroin maintenance or safe injection sites, which have become standard operating procedure in other countries, that has no intellectual legitimacy whatsoever. The refusal to engage in any serious debate about legalization, even marijuana legalization. So there's a sense in which the drug czar seems increasingly irrelevant to the major thrust of where drug policy needs to be headed and maybe is headed. I mean, if there's anything good they've done, it's understanding that the new health care bill is going to open up all sorts of new possibilities for dealing with addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal issue. And I think that is an important step in the right direction. I have to say, the quality of media coverage of the drug war and drug policy has improved absolutely dramatically. I mean, I remember when I first got involved in this in the late 80s and early 90s, a lot of the people covering the drug issue, they wanted nothing so much as to ride around in the cop cars, go for the drug bus, and do that kind of dramatic coverage, and there was no real honest looking at things. It seemed like most of the people working in the area either would lie about their own drug use or had their own issues around it. Now you have people who are intrigued by the cultural evolution that's going on around marijuana. You have serious substantive articles about the economics of drug policy and drug policy reform. You have more thoughtful pieces reflecting on the failure of the war on drugs. You have USA Today with cover stories, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, important stories about the emerging marijuana industry, medical marijuana industry. Prop 19 was transformative in terms of elevating the quality of the coverage. And then you have these wonderful things that happen sometimes when an AP reporter, I think her name is Mendoza, writes a major piece about 40 years of drug war failure and $1 trillion down the drain. So I really think, it's when you think about the coverage of the Vietnam War, and you think about the difference between the guys, the journalists who would show up at each Monday morning or whatever for the briefings by the military brass, by William Westmoreland, and contrast that with the David Halberstams and the other people, the much more critical journalists, the ones who wanted to get to the real story, the ones who wanted to ask the tough questions, the ones who saw themselves as having a professional and ethical obligation to really critically examine the government policies. I think you're seeing more of that happening in the media these days. There's a few really important things happening in terms of public opinion. The most dramatic one is with respect to marijuana. When you look at that Gallup poll, the one that's been asking the same question since the late 1960s, which is, do you favor legalizing, do you believe that marijuana use should be legalized? And when you see the numbers jumping from 36% just 5 years ago to 46% in favor today, when you see it's 58% out west and a substantial majority of Democrats and liberals and men for that matter, when you see those shifts, something's going on there that's about a broader change in the culture. And I think that to the it actually feels like we actually have a chance now of taking marijuana out of the criminal justice system. And marijuana may not be what's filling the state and federal prisons, but marijuana possession does account for over 40% of the 1.6, 1.7 million drug arrests each year. So that would be a major step forward. I think the second thing is there's this dawning recognition that locking up huge numbers of people, that more than quadrupling our incarcerated population since 1980, that leading the world in incarceration rates, that's spending tens and tens of billions of dollars on locking people up and thereby diminishing their life prospects, their families' life prospects, that is not a smart use of taxpayer money, that maybe there's something a little morally wrong with it, that both Democrats and Republicans can agree we need to find ways to shrink the prison population while continuing to protect public safety. I think that dawning realization is penetrating the public and political consciousness around the country. So I think those are the two really important developments. I think that the third one, where we still have a long way to go, ultimately what we need to do is really to end the criminalization of drug use and drug possession entirely. I mean, still hold people responsible if they're high and behind the wheel of a car in the workplace or what have you. But when you look at what Portugal has done, when you look at other European countries are doing, which is essentially putting forward the notion that nobody should be going to jail or prison simply for using or possessing a drug if they're not hurting anybody else. That's an area where the public can embrace that notion so long as people are then being forced into drug treatment. But what we need to do is to separate those two things. We need to get the public to embrace the notion that nobody goes to jail or prison simply for drug use or drug possession, and separately, that treatment and other services are best made available to the people who need them, and in a way that's respectful and effective. And I think that's going to be the next front that I and Drug Policy Alliance and the Drug Policy Reform Movement are going to be pushing on very strongly in years to come. There was really no drug policy reform movement to speak of in the 1980s. And what's emerged since that time, are organizations like the Drug Policy Alliance, like the Harm Reduction Coalition, like the organizations like Marijuana Policy Project, NORML, Americans for Safe Access, working on the marijuana issues, like Families Against Mandatory Minimums, like the groups working in the psychedelics area. I mean, there's a range of national organizations and state organizations, and the way we're ultimately going to transform national drug policy is by building up the power, the strength, the sophistication of these organizations. I've committed my life really to trying to build both a powerful national advocacy organization in Drug Policy Alliance and also helping to build a powerful national, even international drug policy reform movement. We are hugely more advanced than we were just 5 or 10 years ago. The momentum is with us, and I think that we can accomplish a hell of a lot more in just the next few years.